Have you signed off on the idea basically that it doesn't raise very much money?
Well, we think on the basis of academic evidence, for example, the stuff that was done by the Institute for Fiscal Studies when I was there a few years ago, and the new information that's come out from HMRC on what taxpayers appear to have been doing in 2010-11. But on balance, it seems that people have responded more to the introduction of the 50p rate than the original costings set out by the previous government suggested. That has two implications. One, it means that the cut from 50p to 45p looks cheaper than it otherwise would do. We're moving from just above the level of the additional rate that would raise most money to just below it, so you don't get very much change there at all. But from our point of view, it's also important to look at the impact this has on the underlying forecast. So this is also consistent with the fact that PAYE income tax receipts have been coming in a bit weaker than we've expected since the 50p rate was put in. So it also helps us to explain some of that as well. But it's important to caveat this with the fact that any estimates of how much these sorts of tax changes raise or cost is enormously uncertain, because it is very difficult to predict how people on those sorts of incomes are going to respond in terms of the amount of tax planning, avoidance, evasion they do, and whether they make genuine adjustments in their supply of labour, how much they work, whether they retire early, whether they leave the country, etc. So there'll be inconclusive PhDs written on how much this really cost or raise many years into the future.
Is that going to work with that noise? Are you all right? Judgment here is important politically, even though you're not making a political judgment. Would you not have had more, would you not be in a better position to tell just how much the 50p rate would have raised had you the data from this year, for example?
Well, I think obviously if the government had decided to wait longer before making this decision, then you would have had more data for HMRC to chew over and for people to analyse the changes. You would certainly not have been in a position to come up with a definitively correct answer in 2 years that you can't come up with now. The uncertainties will still be there in a couple of years' time as they are now. But if the government decides it's going to cut this tax rate, then we have to make a choice. We have to make an assumption about how people are going to respond to it in order to decide whether the Treasury's costing of this is reasonable and central or not. And we also have to look at the implications it has for our own forecast. So it's difficult, but we can't throw up our hands and say we're not going to do it just because of that.
But this is a judgment based on limited data.
Yes. This is a judgment based on not even a full year's data in terms of how people have responded to the 50p rate, in particular in terms of those self-assessment taxpayers. So what essentially you've had is the HMRC analysis suggesting considerably greater behavioural response to the 50p rate, which would imply a bigger fall in taxable income, would imply even less revenue, or perhaps even that the cut to 45p would have raised money. We don't think that the evidence base is strong enough to go that far. We think it's more sensible to stick with a number that's pretty close to the one that my colleagues came up with the IFS a few years ago in terms of thinking about how these relatively well-off people are likely to respond. But as we were saying then, and I would repeat it now, there is huge uncertainty around those sorts of estimates of how people's behaviour changes.
So we don't have definitive proof that the 50p didn't work?
Well, it's for the government to decide what it wants these tax rates to achieve. It's no part of the OBR's job to say whether it is a good idea or not. We're just there to say how much can you reasonably estimate that these changes raise or cost. At the moment, our best guess is that it's raised not the 2.7 billion. If you believe that people are likely to have responded more to that in terms of changing the amount of tax evasion, tax avoidance they do, the way they change their labour supply response, it might look as though it was more likely to raise maybe 0.7 billion or a little over 1 billion, depending on exactly how you calculate it. So it's suggesting that the original estimate of revenue may have been overestimated by 1.5 or 2 billion.
And that, therefore, cutting it doesn't lose you that much revenue?
Cutting the given the assumptions that we've made about how people's behaviour is likely to respond, cutting the 50p rate to 45p really has very little impact in terms of revenue. And that's because the behavioural response you assume essentially implies that the income tax rate at which you would get most money is 48p or thereabouts. So if you're moving from just above that to just below that, it really doesn't make a great deal of difference. Cutting it further below 45p would be proportionately more expensive.
One last thing, the basis upon which you make these judgments and the deep economics that you're talking about, the Laffer curve, and is this dispassionate, provable economics, or is it theory? Is it just theory that you said that 48p is the perfect tax rate to maximise your tax take? It has profound implications for politics. Is it pure economics? Unarguable.
The costing of these sorts of tax changes is by no means unarguable. You're having to try to estimate how people's incomes would have been moving in the absence of these sorts of tax changes. So for one thing, you have to disentangle the colossal amount of forestalling that has taken place. This fact that people appear to have shifted about £16 billion of income into 2009-10 out of future years to take advantage of the tax rate. You then also have to say, well, what is the underlying behavioural response? What are the long-lasting changes to tax evasion, tax avoidance, to the people's retirement behaviour, whether they emigrate or not? Now, you can come up with a robust methodology for estimating all of that, but no one should be under any illusion that the answers are certain. There is an enormous amount of uncertainty here. Our job is to come up with our best estimate and to be very candid with people about the enormous uncertainties that lie around it.